Okay, Chapter 5, Stephen Stroh, The Illustrated Story of Stephen Stroh by Michael D. Vinsel, that's me. All right, and today we're going to do Chapter 5. Here we go. Okay, Chapter 5, Summer Sets In. Holmes did come back to work after the hazing. It was Jesse who did not join the crew for thinning the remaining McCowns. Ted Castro, perhaps with subtle wisdom, Stephen suspected, had taken Jesse off that duty in order for him to learn how to operate a bin master. A bin master is a machine used during the harvest to pick up and convey 6 full apple bins at a time. It is towed behind a large tractor and has 2 parallel steel rails about 24 feet long. The rails are set apart the same distance as the blades on a forklift. They are mounted with hydraulic lifts on a set of 4 wheels about mid-length. The driver lowers the rails and backs under a line of 6 full apple bins, raises the hydraulic lifts, and carries away the bins. Rockmount Orchards owned 2 of them. With Jesse gone, the thinning was completed without further disruption. By the end of June, the apples were the size of billiard balls and growing quickly. McIntosh's, Cortland's, the mainstays of Rockmount Orchards, were still pale green with no red showing yet. The heat of summer had set in. Stephen resumed operating the cutter bar. He and a new guy named Greg Edison were sent to mow the weeds at Wayne Mountain, a beautiful block about 5 miles away from the packing house. It was up Leesboro Center Road, just past the general store, and up a mile or so of narrow paths through the woods from there. Ted Castro introduced Greg to Stephen in the packing house before work began. They shook hands. Greg was a big, heavy-set man in his late 20s, with short, sand-colored hair and a stubble beard that looked like 3 days' growth. "I take it you both have sunscreen, hats, and adequate water? It's going to be over 90 today," Ted Castro said. They had those things. "Very well. Stephen, you'll be on the 2000. Mr. Edison, you'll be on the 601. I'll leave it to you, Stephen, to instruct Mr. Edison on any particulars he might need to know regarding the cutter bar," Ted Castro said, and he sent them out. Walking up to the parked tractors, Stephen and Greg talked. "Yeah, I remember your brother Matt from junior high. I was kind of in a different group of friends from him, though." "What's he doing now?" Greg asked. "He's out in San Francisco. I don't know what he does for a job," Stephen said. "I see. I got 2 boys, one 8, one 12. You got any kids?" "No, not yet," Stephen said. "Married?" asked Greg. "Not yet," Stephen said. "Girlfriend?" "Working on it," Stephen said. Stephen had no particular girlfriend prospects and hoped to divert the conversation. Stephen showed Greg the morning tractor routine and how to operate the cutter bar. "You ever driven a tractor before?" Stephen asked. "Yeah," Greg snickered. "I guess I have driven a tractor before," he said. They fueled up their tractors and drove up Center Road toward Wayne Mountain. Along the way, Stephen noticed the grapes along the section that Doreen had mentioned. They indeed did hang low over the road. He could see the little grapes forming like little bunches of green peas as his tractor passed under the grapevines. Stephen looked back to point them out to Greg. So Stephen knew that during the harvest there would be a time when he would pass under those grapes every morning when they harvested Wayne Mountain. The Haney, the Herrick, the Smith. After a frost, the grapes would become sweet overnight. He knew that. That's how wild grapes are. One day they are sour, and then that night there's a frost, and the next day they are sweet. Stephen remembered it was his neighbor, Mrs. Melrose, who'd showed him that when he and she had been walking in the woods a long time ago. This fall, Stephen would stop and pick some of these grapes every day, he planned. He knew he would be there that morning after the first frost to experience the remarkable change in the character of the grapes. He looked forward to that. Stephen and Greg drove into Leesboro Center Village. Stephen pulled his tractor into the parking space in front of the general store. Greg parked his tractor behind the 2000. Stephen got off the tractor. "You want a coffee?" he asked. "I'm coming in just a second," Greg said, climbing down off the 601. The Leesboro General Store was a white clapboard building with a large rectangular facade like Stephen had seen in Western movies. The inside of the store smelled like old wood, a musty smell, but pleasant. That smell mixed with the smells of coffee and shepherd's pie that was baking and would be ready to sell at lunchtime. But Stephen had brought his own lunch. The worn plank floor creaked with each step. "Want to get some beers for the afternoon?" Stephen asked Greg. "Sounds great," Greg said. They bought 2 6-packs and a styrofoam cooler. The ice was free from the machine outside. "This block we're doing is pretty nice. It's not so huge. We can get it done, then drink beer till 4, then head back," Stephen said. The Ford 2000 had a spot just behind the shifter where a cooler could fit. They started their tractors and drove up the road, then turned onto the path through the woods to Wayne Mountain. The path ran through dark hemlock woods between 2 stone walls covered with thin, wispy poison ivy vines. The forest ended, and hayfields spread out on either side of the path. In the sunshine, the stone walls were covered with fearsome, thick poison ivy vines that gripped the stones like pythons. The path merged with the driveway to Mr. Herrick, the landowner's house. His driveway led down to Leesboro Center Road, but on the far side of Wayne Mountain. The trail through the woods was a shortcut. In the winter, it was used as a snowmobile trail. Further up the trail, past the house, off to the left, was a large pond formed by a concrete dam. A trail split off to the left and led out atop a long, straight, grass-covered dike that formed the edge of the pond. The grassy embankment sloped down to the water. They stopped the tractors, and Stephen stashed the cooler in the shade of some trees beside the pond. The water looked clear and clean and shimmered in the morning light. A glittering patch of reflected sunlight moved across the surface, following a warm morning breeze. Wayne Mountain ascended from the far bank of the pond. Stephen and Greg went back to the tractors and drove up the main trail up the broad hillside with pine forest on the left and apple orchard on the right. At the top of the orchard, the view was spectacular. They stopped the motors. "You know how to replace broken teeth on the cutter bar?" Stephen asked Greg. "Cold chisel and rivets," Greg said. "Yep, those are in the box on the fender," Stephen said. Greg shuffled through the contents. "Rivets, chisel, dikes, that's what the workers call diagonal cutters." More shuffling. "This your condom?" Greg joked. "Not mine." "I got everything but a hammer," Greg said. "I got one," Stephen said. "I'll find you if I need it." They started the tractors up again and began cutting the weeds. Stephen working down from the top, Greg working up from the bottom. The cutter bar was working smoothly, making its metallic hasping sound. Stephen took care to avoid rocks. He wanted to finish as quickly as possible. Thick white clover, spike-headed timothy, and wild mustard grew between the trees. Their stalks vibrated as the blades cut their bases. The weeds fell back gracefully as Stephen drove. The air warmed quickly. By 9 o'clock, all traces of dew were gone, and Stephen noticed that the sound of the blades had changed. It had become sharper, more metallic. No stalks caught in the machinery or dragged behind ungracefully, Stephen observed. The method was to cut each row from the upper side, with the cutter bar reaching as far under the drip line of the trees as possible without scraping the branches on the tractor wheels. At the end of each row, they would turn to the downhill side. The tractor moved slowly enough that it was easy to avoid rocks. Stephen watched the machine carefully as he worked. At lunchtime, Greg and Stephen walked down to reconnoiter the pond. It was about the size of a football field. They stood on the dike, looking down into the water. The bottom was sand with an accumulation of pine needles settled over the bottom. The most recent pine needles were still recognizable, reddish-brown, as they would be on the forest floor. Underneath the pine needles was a thin layer of black muck. Stephen and Greg noticed several spots where the pine needles and muck appeared to have been swept away. Each of these spots had a slightly raised ring of sand about a foot in diameter. "Sunfish nests," Greg said. "Ha! Look at that," Stephen said. Then Stephen saw two giant largemouth bass cruising slowly up from the left. "Look at those bass," he whispered excitedly. "Wow, they must be 20 inches long," Greg said, trying to keep his voice low. The two bass cruised by unspooked. Aquatic plants grew in patches in the shallow water close to the edge. To Stephen, it looked like the pond must have been built perhaps 20 years ago, and those plants were only beginning their colonization. Stephen had read about the life cycle of beaver dams and had learned in school that all ponds were destined to become land over time. He liked trying to imagine how everything would change over time. Do you ever think about the long-term cycle of things? I mean, like this pond, how long will it last? Stephen asked. Not really. I suppose it'll be here for as long as we're around, Greg said. Stephen remembered a beaver pond he'd fished when he was younger. It was the same one that the trout pond stream drained into, just downstream from where he caught his first trout. He remembered going back one day after several years and finding no pond. The pond had become a field with a small stream wending through it. Okay, and here's a picture of that. So there's a beaver pond. Okay, and that would be about when Stephen was just a kid. Okay. Yeah. He contemplated that there is no system that flushes out the accumulated pine needles, leaves, and silt on the bottoms of ponds, and every year a new layer is deposited. That will eventually become muck on the bottom, and eventually that accumulation of muck will reach closer and closer to the surface of the water. In time, storm winds will push some of the muck to high water points of the storms. When the water recedes, that muck will be exposed to air. Wind-blown seeds will land and take root on the little tufts of fresh earth and begin their lives on those little islands. Those plants will give way to trees, whose roots will further drain the soil and contribute to the process by which the pond will eventually become land. Stephen had also read about that process in books and had heard about it in school, but he had also seen and observed many beaver ponds while fishing. Stephen knew that for the first few years of any new beaver dam, the fishing is very good. The tiny brook trout that inhabited what had been a trickle of a brook suddenly find themselves the residents of a large and food-rich body of water. Those trout grow big, and there is a period of several years when good-sized trout can be caught in those waters. Even the intensity of the color and taste of the fish is different from beaver pond to beaver pond, Stephen remembered, depending on how much tannin had leached from the watershed litter, what mix of trees populated that watershed, and even what type of stone lay beneath the soil. Stephen recalled that once when he'd been fishing with Matthew at that same beaver pond, Matthew had pointed out pine stumps that had been gnawed down by the beavers. Matthew had said that when the beavers had resorted to cutting down pine trees, it indicated that they had already eaten all the aspens and willows that they liked, and the pond would soon be abandoned. After the beavers would move on, one or another flood of spring snowmelt would wash out the dam, and the pond would be no more. The watercourse would return to its original form, wending its way through the field of silty soil that had been the bottom of the pond. The old beaver lodge would remain for years, as would the remains of the dam, eventually becoming a grass-covered hump and a ridge in a field forlornly punctuated by the skeletons of trees that had died when the dam was first built, some with the ghostly remains of heron nests still held in the crooks of their sun-bleached branches. Okay, so here's a picture of that. So this is kind of a before and after from the previous picture. So this one would be before, when the pond is there, and then about 5 years later, when he went back and the dam had been gone. It was gone. Okay. The concrete dam at Wayne Mountain was unlikely to wash out for many years, so the pace of this pond's transformation back to land would be slowed, but not stopped, Stephen figured. It occurred to Stephen that his 5th grade teacher, Mrs. Little, had explained that process in science class. Stephen remembered that Billy Crow, sitting next to him in the back row, had been trying to disrupt that class. Mrs. Little patiently continued explaining despite Billy's carrying on. Stephen had gotten angry at Billy and told him to shut up and listen. Stephen wondered why, if he'd had the guts to stand up to Billy Crow back in 5th grade, why had he followed along with Jesse in hazing Holmes? I remember in 5th grade, our teacher, Mrs. Little, explained that all ponds and lakes will eventually fill in, that they are temporary. Some might last millions of years, others might last only a few years, but eventually all ponds will become land, Stephen said to Greg. I remember that same lesson. I never liked school. In fact, I quit when I was 17. But I remembered that. I think that's like the only lesson I really remember from school, Greg said. That day at Wayne Mountain, Greg and Stephen finished cutting the weeds by 2:30. They drove the tractors down to the pond and parked them on the trail atop the dike. Stephen propped the cooler level with stones, removed the lid, and the 2 men looked down at the cans of Pabst Blue Ribbon shining silver, red, white, and blue, the ice glistening in the sunshine. Greg looked as if he were looking at a rainbow for the first time. "That is so beautiful," he said. They reached into the ice, grabbed cans, peeled back the flip tabs, and drank. Greg guzzled and let out a terrific sigh. You know, there really is nothing better in the world on a hot day than cold beer. "I'm going in," Greg said. He guzzled his whole can, crumpled it, and tossed it beside the cooler, stood up, and stripped off his clothes and walked right out into the water. Stephen stripped, took 2 cans from the cooler, and swam out to give one to Greg. "Swimming and drinking. Ain't this paradise?" Greg shouted. He kicked his legs to bring his body flat to the surface and rested his beer can on his chest. "For Jesus, I've finally found a place I can live," he hollered to the sky. They drank and swam in the afternoon sun, having finished the work assigned them for the day. Stephen closed his eyes and floated on his back. He drifted to the far edge of the pond, where the sunlight filtered through wispy pine boughs. He opened his eyes for just a second to catch the sun gleaming through the branches, and then shut them again. It was fun drifting in the pond with his eyes closed. They swam back to the shallower water near the tractors, where the sunfish nests were. They treaded water in the shallows over the nests. "You feel them fish biting you?" "All these little fish are biting my legs," Greg said. Stephen stuck his feet in the muck and stood still in the water and noticed the strange nibbling sensation on his legs. He looked down in the water and could see the little green sunfish nibbling his legs. "This is like that place in Turkey or somewhere where people go to have those doctor fish nibble on their legs. You ever heard about that?" Greg asked. Stephen said he had heard about that somewhere. They swam back to the cooler, dried off and got dressed, sat in the grass, and each opened another can. Okay, here's a picture of the swimming there with beers and the pond. Okay, so what'd you do for work before this? Stephen asked. "Oh, I've had a lot of jobs, none of them good. The last one was a laborer at the Partridge Lane Mall. I was just a temp, helping a guy install the car lifts in the garage there. When that was done, the guy didn't have anything else for me, so I came here," Greg said. Greg had promised his wife that he would not tell anybody about the fight in the county farm. She told him he didn't have to tell anybody about those things and that he shouldn't. He resolved to himself that he would not mention those things. "How about you?" Greg asked Stephen. "Well, I just graduated from New Dartford High last December. Started working here in January. I used to wash dishes at the White Horse after school. That's all the work I've ever done." "December. You stay back?" Greg asked. Stephen answered, "Yeah, twice. First grade and senior year of high school. If I hadn't made it out in December, I'd have been 20 when I graduated, but I was still 19. Greg held up his beer. "Cheers to you. At least you stuck it out," he said. They had a can each left when it was almost 4 o'clock. Stephen gave Greg one for the road and dumped the ice. They backed their tractors out to the dirt path and drove down to the road back to the packing house. Okay, this is a good time to take a break. So this is the middle of chapter 5.